welcome to the Adjusted for Risk podcast from the shores of Lake Tahoe. So it has been another really interesting week for markets, and the headline event was the release of the May CPI or inflation report and the June University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Report. And neither of them were very promising. And let me go back for a second. As a Wisconsin Badger fan, it's really hard for me to take seriously the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Report. In fact, it's really hard for me to actually include this in a podcast, but it is very telling. So I am going to have to comment on the University of Michigan Sentiment Report. So let's go ahead and get started with the inflation print. I have gone on record, and I was just on a TD Ameritrade network, and hence the blue collared button-down shirt. And I announced there that I have been wrong on inflation for the past year. I have been drinking too much of the Federal Reserve's transitory Kool-Aid, and I thought it was transitory also. And I also thought inflation had rolled over last month. Well, I have been wrong. So I'm going to put that out there. Hopefully that will be the last time. But it really puts an end to that inflation has peaked. Until we get some easing in gas and food prices and demand cools, we will be seeing inflation stay near this 8.6% for the next few months. High gas and other commodity prices will remain elevated and will keep inflation stubborn. For example, the Bloomberg Commodity Index has hit record highs. Another piece of that puzzle, which is even maybe a little bit more troublesome because it's a stickier portion and a bigger portion of inflation, is shelter, or that housing component, which makes up about a third of the CPI print. And that rose over 5% year over year in May. And as I said, that rent or the shelter component is very sticky. So don't expect that to come down anytime soon or at all. Then you have airfare prices, which isn't going to be quite as sticky, but when you consider airfare prices surged by nearly 38% year over year, which I think is really going to remain high for the next couple of months moving forward, is because fuel costs are high. So airline prices are going to be high. And plus, you still have a lot of demand. There's a lot of demand out there for travel. And those two pieces are going to keep airfare prices high. So there's other things other than just gas and food prices that keep me not as optimistic that inflation has peaked yet. And when you look at core inflation, which strips out the very erratic and prices of energy and food, that's still over 6%. So, which is still high. So inflation, I don't think over the next couple of months is going to decline anytime soon. And as a result of the hot inflation print, it's going to keep the Federal Reserve aggressive. Will the Fed put a 75 basis point hike back on the table? As you recall, Jerome Powell during their last meeting really took that 75 basis point hike off the table. I think they really should reconsider a 75 basis point hike and put it back on the table. Number one, I think it will help with their credibility. They made a mistake by waiting too long to end their accommodative policies, and that has really put them behind the curve. And I don't think markets really will react negatively, especially when you consider consumers are having to pay such high prices at the pump, at the grocery stores. A 75 basis point hike, something much more aggressive than what they've been signaling, might be applauded by markets because it gives credence to, hey, the Fed is serious to taming inflation. And right now, inflation and higher prices are the biggest impact and hindrance to investors and to consumers. I think it's time to rip that Band-Aid off and really go full throttle at fighting inflation. And that means a 75 basis point hike. A soft landing has always the thought of a soft landing is always going to be difficult. And with no end in sight for high inflation, a soft landing is even more difficult. So I think it's time just to go ahead and really go full force at taming inflation. As for sentiment, high inflation really, rather than a tight labor market, is driving sentiment. And in today's report, 46% of the University of Michigan respondents attributed their negative views to persistent price pressures. So 46% of the people are saying inflation or high prices are impacting their confidence. And not surprising when you consider year over year, real average earnings is now at a negative 3.9%. When you consider that real earnings, you're not earning more than inflation, you're earning wage increases are not keeping up with inflation, that's impacting sentiment. So it's no surprise that sentiment is down at all-time lows, record lows when it reached 50. A couple of things to think about here too is the 12-month correlation that I find interesting. The 12-month correlation between unemployment rate and sentiment has spiked above the long-term average. And when you think about the relationship between sentiment and the unemployment rate, you think it should be inverse, right? When the unemployment rate falls, sentiment should be high. It should be, at 80, 90, 100. But that's not happening. They're actually moving together. Unemployment rate has fallen down to 3.6% over the past year, but so has sentiment. Sentiment has also been falling with the unemployment rate. So that correlation has spiked, which you shouldn't think would happen. Conversely, the 12-month correlation between inflation and sentiment has fallen well below long-term averages. And this makes sense. When inflation is high, sentiment should be low. And that's what you're seeing right now. So you're seeing sentiment is being driven more by inflation and not so much the strong labor market. Despite sentiment being at its lowest on record, consumers continue to spend. Consumer spending has increased 4 straight months, and travel has increased. Like I said, the prices for airfare have increased, 37, nearly 38%. So there's a high demand for travel, and I don't think that's going to slow anytime soon. So consumers are willing to spend despite inflation being so high and sentiment being so low. But sentiment, I do feel, will remain low due to rising interest rates and stubborn inflation, which will eventually impact and slow spending. I think consumers will eventually pull back in discretionary spending, and that's going to eventually slow the economy, and it also impact inflation too. Here's one thing I found very interesting is in JP Morgan's Guide to the Markets piece, which is a fantastic piece. The average 12-month return for the S&P 500 is 24.9% following sentiment lows. So when the consumer sentiment hits a trough or hits its low, the following 12 months, the equities typically on average return nearly 25% during those next 12 months. Now the question is, when does sentiment hit its low, right? Right now we're at 50, which is its all-time low. I think it's going to fall lower as inflation remains stubborn and interest rates climb. So have we reached that low in sentiment where, equities are going to start its rebound and rebound strong? I don't think so. But I found that very interesting that once sentiment does hit its trough, equities perform very well. It goes along with Warren Buffett's be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful. All right, moving along to staying sharp. So I recently wrote about the evolving performance behavior of major US equity indexes. Just like sector weightings change over time, so does their behavior. And it begs the question, when the composition and the style behavior of an index evolves over time, is it really appropriate to use that same index for a long-term analysis when it evolves and the behavior changes so much over time? So based on the underlying holdings of an index, as the S&P 500 index, as of May 31st of this year, the information technology sector makes up 27%, and that's really not a surprise. It makes up 27% of the S&P 500 index, compared to a weighting of 19% in 2012. So while the information technology sector was also the largest sector in 2012 at 19%, it wasn't nearly as dominant as it is today. In 2012, the financial sector was the second largest sector with a weighting of 15.6%, compared to only 11.2% at the end of May. So as you can see, while the information technology weighting has increased, the financial sector has decreased in its weighting within the S&P 500. The healthcare stocks made up 12% in 2012 and 14% in the most recent update from S&P Dow Jones indices. So the healthcare has remained relatively the same. So the declining weight in energy sector is really what's noteworthy to me. Back in 2012, the weight of the energy sector was 11%. 2012, it made up 11% of the S&P 500. In May of 2022, it fell to 4.8% of the S&P 500. It's worth noting that weight of the energy sector, it's also increased since December from 2.7% in December 2021 to 4.8%. So only a few months ago, that energy sector was made up only 2.7% of the S&P 500. And really that increase is largely due to the big price rally in energy stocks this year. In 2012, the energy sector was the fifth largest sector in the index, while the year before it was the third largest at 12%. And if you go all the way back to 1989, it was 12.5% of the index and the third largest sector, following the consumer discretionary sector at 14.5%. Interestingly, when you go back that far, the information technology sector made up 6% of the index in 1989 and only 2% of the index in 1999. So you can see how the S&P 500, when you look at the holdings and the sector weights, has really evolved over the years. So over the years, the behavior of the S&P 500 index, or the percentage of returns that can be explained by the individual sectors, has evolved greatly over the years. And another way of calling it is returns-based style analysis. So for example, during the 3 years ending December 2004, roughly 13% of the S&P 500 returns could be explained by the information technology sector. So 13% of the returns could be explained by the information technology sector in December 2004. Now you fast forward to the 3-year period ending April 2022, and over 31% of the S&P 500 returns behave like the information technology sector. It's quite the increase. Over 18 years, 13% of the returns could be explained by the information technology sector, and that's increased to 31% of the returns could be explained by the information technology sector. So with more and more performance being attributed to the tech sector, the percentage of overall performance attributed to other sectors has declined. At its peak, the energy sector explained 13% of the S&P 500 returns during the 3 years ending October 2009. However, that energy allocation has been slowly diminishing and reached less than 0.5% during the 3 years ending September 2021. It's a similar story for the financial and industrial sectors. For the 3 years ending January 2006, over 21% of the S&P 500 returns were explained by the industrial sector. However, that allocation has fallen to zero over the past 7 3-year rolling periods. Think about that again. For the 3 years ending January 2006, the industrial sector explained 21% of the S&P 500 returns. Today, the industrial sector explains 0% of the returns. So interesting, that story flips when you look at the performance behavior of the equal weighted version of the S&P 500. I found this very interesting. The behavior might be a surprise to some, as it's a complete opposite from the cap weighted S&P 500 index that we just explained. During the 3 years ending December 2004, over 22.5% of the equal weighted S&P 500 returns were explained by the information technology sector. That was back in 2004. Fast forward to the 3-year period ending April 2022, and only 0.15%, yes, 0.15% of the S&P 500 performance, equal weighted performance, behaves like the information technology sector. Okay, it actually decreased. So it went from 22.5% to 0.15. That's a complete opposite change from the cap weighted version of the S&P 500. Okay, so it's very interesting when you look at how the performance behavior of indexes change. So to that initial question, so if you determine it's not appropriate, you may want to consider using a broader market index like the Russell 3000, which exhibits much more consistent performance behavior over the long term. That performance behavior for the Russell 3000 is much more consistent than either one of the S&P 500 indexes. Conversely, a more concentrated index like the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which holds only 30 stocks, really exhibits much more erratic and inconsistent behavior. One could often say its behavior is similar to that of a teenager, very erratic. All right, let's move along to Nauman's musings. So growing up, my parents always said they enjoyed watching my sisters play sports more than watching my teams play sports. And in large part because they thought the girls' team showed more energy and there was more excitement, and they just played harder. Recently, my 4-year-old son and my 5-year-old adopted son finished playing their soccer and t-ball seasons, and it was really a contrasting different attitudes story. They both really enjoyed soccer, actually more than t-ball, but not surprising. Oliver, my 4-year-old son, he's probably never going to be the biggest or the fastest or the strongest kid, but during the season he played really hard. He never scored a goal, But he always tried and ran as hard as he could. It made you really feel good. Before every game, some of the games I had to coach, our coach wasn't there. I always told the boys to have fun, listen to their coaches, and don't give up or don't quit. And Oliver never did. He never scored a goal. A lot of the kids were bigger, faster. They were better at soccer, but he played very hard and he always listened. Whereas Ryder, my adopted son, he could have been the best player in the whole league. And at times he was. When he flipped the switch and you got him more motivated and interested in it, he was the best player in the league. And a lot of times we actually had to tell him to rein it back, stand back in goal, because he just was really, it wasn't fair. But it took a lot more encouragement, a lot more urging, to get him to play and to, but when he did, it was something special. So it's such a contrast, and how, granted they're 4 or 5 years old, but how they really can play. And it goes along with life, I think, too. Some people need more encouragement than others. Others might be more motivated than others. There's some people that have all the talent in the world, but might need a little bit more fire lit underneath them. And we saw that play out in sports. In our last game, the other team didn't have enough players, so we decided to go kids, or the players, against the parents. And it was great. It was probably the best game the boys played because they wanted to beat their parents so bad. And Oliver scored, I think, 3 goals. And granted, the defense wasn't exactly stellar, but it is so great as a father to see that smile and joy out of when your son or your daughter achieves something they've been trying so hard to achieve over the past eight weeks, and finally score. All the other parents and kids gave him a standing ovation because they knew how hard he had worked throughout the season, and to finally see it pay off. He was so happy, and Ryder was so happy for him. It was really great to see. And you can see that in other aspects of life too. Be happy for other people's success, even if it may come at the expense of yours. Be happy. This world is, there's so much, hate in it and so much going on. Be happy when other people succeed. Don't take away from it. And it is so great to see people so happy when they finally achieve a goal. So with that, with all the bad news out there, hopefully maybe that lifts some hearts a little bit. But I hope you all have a fantastic week ahead. Maybe markets turn. The Fed has a meeting. Maybe markets will applaud their decision. Maybe they become more hawkish. But with that being said, I'm going to sign off. Thank you so much for watching and joining the Adjusted for Risk podcast. You can go ahead and follow us on our YouTube channel, Adjusted for Risk, as well as our blog, which is Wealth of Insight from 6,237 feet. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your week.